Okay, so for this class and the next few classes, we're going to be talking about the different branches of government. We've already covered it so much to some extent when we went over the Constitution, but now we're going to go a little more, deeper into each of the three branches of government, try to explain them in a little more detail, as well as explain, problematic aspects with different branches of government also. So we'll start with the Congress here. Congress, you can see, is of course, as we've already said, divided up into the House and Senate. But now we see a little bit more of a breakdown of the leadership structure that you see in both the House and Senate. For the most part, they're fairly similar. Of course, in the House, you have the Speaker of the House, which is a very important position, which I'll talk about uh, in a moment. But you can see, in the Senate, the Vice President of the United States is technically President of the Senate. And that becomes, significant if there is a tie in the Senate. The vice president can cast the tie-breaking vote. Normally, the overseeing of the Senate is usually done by a senior ranking member of the majority party, as you can see here, as well as other members that sometimes preside over the Senate just to sort of move things along. But for the most part, what's important here is talking about the leadership structure that you have. You can see there's a Senate majority and minority leader, just as there is a majority and minority leader in the House. That you also have the majority and minority whip as well. Now, what these officials do basically is more or less sets the agenda of both the House and Senate. They more or less determine how votes are going to be sort of moved along. They make sure that their party votes the right way. That, especially the whip, they're more or less tasked with rounding up votes basically and make sure that when a vote comes to the floor of either the House or Senate, that they have the right number of votes for the bill to move forward. The majority and minority leader also essentially function as kind of the spokesman for the party in either the House or Senate as well. And of course, as you know, there's 100 senators from each, two from each state, and you have 435 representatives elected by the population of the states. So, what does the speaker do? The speaker is obviously a crucial official here. Um, Basically, and in many ways, because the House is a much larger branch of government, there's much more of a need for order and regulation. So again, as you can see here, the speaker basically sets the tone of what is going to be talked about. They make sure, of course, that the legislative procedures in the House uh, are followed. They, in many ways, set the agenda for again what votes are going to move through the House, often working with the party leadership as well. At one point, the speaker did have almost like a dictatorial power to sort of almost by themselves set this kind of agenda. They still retain significant power over that, but now work much more closely in consultation with party leadership as well to again as it says here determine which bills will be brought to the floor for a debate and voted on. They also have power to appoint members to committees. Again, this used to be a power that they had much more of a kind of absolute authority over to a large extent. The Speaker of the House does not actually serve on committees themselves. They do have the again the authority to appoint members to various House uh, committees, including selecting members for the House Rules Committee and other key panels. But again, much more working in close consultation with the party leadership, as well as observing other sort of norms and rules in the House regarding ranking members and who has senior authority and things like that. And of course, the Speaker also basically represents the House as a whole. They're essentially the official representative of the House and dealing with the President, the Senate, and with the public as well. Now, again, the power of the Speaker has changed significantly over time. There have been several, extremely notable speakers of the House, including Henry Clay, James Brackett Reed, later known as Czar Reed, and Joseph Gurney Cadden, who was basically the last Speaker of the House to, reign and have this almost, like I said, kind of dictatorial power, basically, over the proceedings of the House. As I said here, Reed and Cannon were able to control appointments to committees, committee chairmen, and basically personally presided over the House Rules Committee. I'll explain more in detail what the Rules Committee actually does. Cannon was actually stripped of these powers in 1910, although some of these powers were later returned, but not obviously to the same extent. The next slide here can be a bit overwhelming, and I don't expect everybody to know all this. I'm just putting it here. Quite frankly, I mean, the Congress can be somewhat, daunting, can be somewhat overwhelming, like I said, in terms of all the procedural aspects that govern the operations of the Congress, as well as, of course, the sort of unspoken rules, the so-called norms, the political norms that basically shape the conduct and the operations of the Congress as well. So I'm not going to expect everybody to know everything. Basically, this is a slide that kind of breaks down what the changes in the powers of the Speaker were, before the reforms of 1910 and after the reforms of 1910. Suffice to say, if I could just summarize everything here really quickly, like I said, basically, the power of the Speaker has changed to a large extent. Whereas at one point they had almost absolute power over what votes were taken in the House and who got to serve on the various congressional committees, which I'll also talk about in a moment. That power has somewhat changed. They still have great influence over these things, but now it's less of an sort of like a dictatorial power, like I said, and they work much more in closer consultation with the leadership of the House itself. So, okay. Now we turn to the congressional committees, as you can see here. Image might be a little bit blurry. I took it off of the House and Senate website. I'll make this a little bit smaller here so you can see this a little bit better. But basically, before a bill gets voted on by the House and Senate as a whole, for the most part, there are of course exceptions to everything. Most bills go through a committee before they are sort of voted on by the House and Senate. And you can see the breakdown of committees in both the House and Senate here. For the most part, there's a lot of overlap. There are some differences between the two. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of the committees, but you can kind of see what they are here for the most part. Also, keep in mind there are also subcommittees within each committee as well, making this system even more vast and complex. But basically, if you look at some of the names of the committees, you can tell, I think, quite quickly, what the point of this is to refer certain matters of legislation to different committees that can then kind of focus in more on the finer points of the legislation. In other words, a bill regarding agriculture would be referred to the Agriculture Committee in both the House and Senate. As you can see here, there's an Armed Services Committee in each of the House and Senate. The Appropriations Committee, very important one, basically determines where the money is going to be spent. How much money is going to be sort of allocated in the federal budget. You can also see a separate budget committee as well. And what these budget committees do is basically set the overall limits on spending and what the priorities are of spending. A large part of what Congress does, of course, is obviously, just allocating flows of money, raising money through taxes, and then basically determining where that money is going to be spent. Right. The current federal budget now is somewhere around about $7 trillion. So this is a tremendous amount of money to keep track of, and obviously, who gets to determine where that money goes to is an incredible power, obviously. So as such, this power has been broken up not into just several different committees, but also, like I said, various sub committees as well. In the House, you also have something known as the Ways and Means Committee, which is basically in charge of taxation, among other things. But basically, all bills regarding changes in whether raising or lowering taxes has to go through the House Ways and Means Committee, and basically has to originate there. The analog to this in the Senate is the Senate Finance Committee, but it does actually say in the Constitution that the House basically has the initiative in determining bills regarding taxation. I suppose that is a gesture to the idea of, no taxation without representation. The idea that the more democratic branch of government should have the, again, initiative in determining bills regarding taxation. Of course, the Senate still has to approve of it, but the sort of initiative to sort of shape these bills is sort of given to the House, which obviously is a very important power. Aside from that, most of the committees tend to sort of overlap with each other. And again, the basic principle behind this is basically just that you allow some members of Congress to develop a kind of specialization, even a kind of expertise in certain areas of law, and that they will then sort of be charged with the greater task of sort of, again, ironing out all the details of the law. I mean, that's essentially it. But again, the committees then form another critical point at which laws have to proceed, in the process, obviously, of making something into a law. There are also various special select uh, committees in both the House and Senate. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but you can sort of see it here. There are, of course, easily accessible links that you can use. There are various support agencies that play a role as well. Some of them are very important. Um, the Library of Congress, which of course is accessible to most people, but you also have the Congressional Budget Office, the General Accounting Office. You have the Congressional Research Service, and various others. I want to kind of move through this part fairly quickly, and I kind of want to get to here actually. So this is more or less an illustration. Kind of looks like like a board game actually of how the legislative process works. And what you'll see is that it is incredibly difficult to get anything passed through the House and Senate and through the Congress as a whole, of course. So what happens is that any member of the House and Senate can introduce a bill, and as you can see here, the bill gets its a number. It's introduced basically. It's registered in the record. It is then referred to a committee, as you can see, both the House and Senate. Now, in many cases, the assignment to a committee can be somewhat logical, like I said, regarding the nature of the law, but it could also be done with a specific, purpose in mind, serve a certain kind of, agenda, possibly. Um, Now, what happens oftentimes is that when the Congress does not want to vote no on something, but doesn't want to pass something either, it can bury things down so far down the legislative agenda that it simply never gets voted on. And that happens a lot more often than most people would probably think, right? I mean, Congress is not really in session, quite frankly, all that often. They get a pretty long summer break. They get a break in the winter as well. There are other, breaks that they have in between all that. So the amount of time that Congress is in session and can actually vote upon a law is actually quite limited. And so what happens is that oftentimes Congress simply runs out of time. The current session of Congress basically runs out before they can even get to vote on things. So you have many laws, or I'm sorry, not laws, but you have many bills that are introduced in both the House or Senate. Many of them end up never even getting voted upon. And to some extent, that can serve a political purpose as well. Like I said, if the leadership of the House and Senate does not want to vote no on something, perhaps because they're afraid of a kind of public, backlash or something like that. Like say, for example, like voting no on increasing the minimum wage or something like that, then they'll do things to prevent it from ever getting voted upon. So therefore, there's no record of them voting no on something. But then, of course, the thing itself does not get passed either. And this can happen in as early on as the assignment to a committee of a certain bill. The committees have their own sort of calendar of things that they're going to hear and vote upon, and some things get again buried so far down the agenda it never makes it through. Now the committee itself can also bury things so that they do not get voted on either. But all right, so that aside, how does this process work? So it gets assigned to A committee and then usually gets assigned to a sub committee, like I said. And during this committee process, the bill, the finer points of the bill are sort of, worked out. This is also, notably where the role of, lobbyists and interest groups play a very big role in sort of shaping the laws. There are many instances, in fact, actually, of corporations basically, writing laws. They submit, drafts of laws, and it either gets, introduced by, a member of the House and Senate, or they sort of rear their head during this committee so-called markup process, where the finer points of the law are basically drawn out. But during this committee process, the committee calls hearings. It calls in people to give their testimony regarding various parts of the law. They sort of hear arguments on regarding various aspects of the law, including again from lobbyists and various special interest groups, and this all basically shapes the way in which the law is made. So it goes through the subcommittee. This is what they refer to again as markup. Amendments are introduced. Different parts of the law are rewritten. Things are added. Things are taken out. It goes so assuming it goes through the subcommittee, it would then go through the full committee. And only when it makes it through there does it have a chance of getting voted on by both the House or Senate. So let me just go back a little bit and also explain that in the committees themselves, of course, the committees reflect the majority in the House or Senate as a whole. So if the Republicans have a majority in the House, then that means that they also basically have a majority on all of the committees as well. You have members of the other party too, of course, but they form a minority. So whatever party has a majority in the House or Senate will also have a majority in the committees. And of course, if they really want to, they could get something, passed. Um, okay, so then it makes its way through the subcommittee. It makes its way through the full committee. In the House, you also have the addition of something known as the Rules Committee, which I'll explain in a moment. You do not have that in the Senate, but assuming it makes it out of the committee, it then gets basically put on the calendar. Basically set a date and time for when it's going to vote. Assuming that it does make it to that point where there's a date and time for it to be voted on, and then basically the House and Senate vote on it as a whole. And again, as you can see here, either it passes through the House or Senate, it does not pass. In the Senate, you also have the instance of the filibuster as well, which I'll also talk about. But assuming it makes it through, the bill gets passed. Um, Even then, there's an additional step where that the House and Senate basically have to pass the exact same bill. If they pass a similar bill, but one that is not identical, that is not good enough, basically. And of course, that happens often enough, in that the House and Senate do pass similar but different uh, bills. Those have to be reconciled into a single piece of legislation. So then, oftentimes, it goes to what is known as a conference committee, which is made up of both members of the House and Senate. Um, the bills are then ironed out into one single piece of legislation. And would you believe it? Then it then has to go through this entire process again. The newly refined bill has to then pass through the House and Senate again, um, and only then, if the exact same identical bill passes through both the House and Senate, then does it have a chance of being signed into law by the president. Obviously, if the president signs into law, then and only then does it become a law. Although, of course, the president can veto the law as well. And if the president vetoes the law, then it goes back into the House and Senate. They can either change the law, abandon the law, the proposed law, or, like I said, in an earlier class, under certain exceptional circumstances, can they pass with a 2/3 majority? So what you get out of this, hopefully, is that it's an incredibly complicated process. It seems almost a wonder that almost anything ever makes it through the House and Senate as a whole. Now, again, the House tends to be much more regulated, basically, in how debate and how the procedures work in the House as regards to the Senate. The Senate certainly has its fair share of procedures as well. But the House has more definite limits on the amount of time in which a bill can be debated on, whether or not amendments can be introduced to a bill when it's being voted on by the floor of the House by the House as a whole. In other words, the Senate, because it's much less regulated in the amount of time that you can have for a debate, leads to the circumstance where senators can speak for an unlimited amount of time, or for speaks for an extended amount of time, which can basically sort of delay the proceedings of the Senate itself. In the House, you don't really have this issue because, again, the Speaker of the House controls to a large extent the rules of debate in the House, um, as well as with the Rules Committee as well. So I'll explain a little bit more the relationship between the Speaker and the Rules Committee because I think that is important. But as you may have noticed, there's also this kind of sidebar of the Budget Committee as well, and the budget resolutions passed by these committees. So how does that work? Basically, what the Budget Committee does, again, in both the House and Senate, is that it passes a non-binding budget resolution. So the budget resolutions passed do not have to be signed into, are not signed into law by the president. They only pertain to the House and Senate itself. And what they basically do is they kind of set the overall spending limits. They basically say how much money, what's sort of like the limit that we're willing to spend during this session in Congress. And then basically set the priorities, like what kind of spending are we going to prioritize during this session of um, of Congress. Now, crucially, these were only introduced in the 1970s, which is important to keep in mind as well. The budget process has become much more formalized since then. But again, the Budget Committee, along with the Appropriations Committee, plays a significant role in determining the spending levels of the government itself. Here you have another diagram here that basically shows you more or less how the budget process works out. So basically, at the beginning, near the beginning of every year, the president submits their budget request to Congress. Now, the different federal agencies under the control of the president also submit their budget requests. The president, hears them, formulates a budget request, which is sent to the Congress. This is then, heard by the budget committees of the House and Senate. They then draft their own budget resolutions. Yes, there is a conference committee for the budget resolutions as well, as you can see. Now, once this budget resolution passes, again, which determines pretty much the overall spending limits, it is then sort of detailed by the various appropriations committees that exist. Now, as you can see, there are actually 12 sub committees in both the House and Senate. So it's an extraordinary amount. And these subcommittees basically, determine what amount of funding is going to go to various agencies within the government itself. It then goes through, the committee markup process, which I tried to outline already. It then is voted on by both the floor of the House and Senate, and then in most cases will go to a conference committee as well, and then is basically signed into law by the president. And this more or less, in a nutshell, essentially is how the budget process works. And this goes on basically every year. Now, again, as I said, there's a lot of money at stake, right? We're talking literally, trillions of dollars. So it's an incredibly important power which is given to the government. As you can see here, federal spending, in fact, by a pretty significant amount, outstretches the amount of revenue that the government actually has on hand. So the current federal deficit's close to $2 trillion, about 1.7 trillion, in fact. The government spends about $6 trillion, but its tax revenue is about almost $5 trillion, or no, I think about $4.5 trillion dollars or something like that. 6.1 trillion versus 4.5 trillion or something like that. Um, and you can see that the amount of money that the government spends vastly oversteps the revenue that's able to take in. So what are some of the key differences between the Speaker of the House and the Rules Committee? Um, Again, the Speaker has sort of a more broad, overarching, control over the priorities of the House itself. They can decide which bills move forward, set the overall legislative agenda, and engage in high-level negotiations with the Senate and President. What the Rules Committee does is it focuses specifically on the procedural aspects of individual bills, how they are considered by the full House, which amendments are allowed, and the structure of floor debates. While the Speaker, again, controls the timing and flow of legislative action, they do not directly control the terms under which each bill is debated. They may intervene in the legislative process, but don't set the floor rules for the individual bills. The Rules Committee directly sets the term for the debate and control how legislation is handled on the House floor. In other words, how long people are going to have to debate bills, as well as whether or not you can introduce amendments or not. Some bills do not allow for that. Some allow members of the House to introduce changes on the House floor, basically. So again, that's some indication of what the difference is between the Speaker and the Rules Committee. And again, I would say what they both have in common is that the or why you see the importance of the Speaker and the Rules Committee in the House is in many ways related to the larger size of the House compared to the Senate. And now, if I could take people briefly through the process in which the 14th Amendment was passed, it kind of gives you an indication of how this legislative process works. Now, in this case, we're talking about a constitutional amendment. This is a little bit different, obviously, but it does, for the most part, kind of follow a very similar process. So after the Civil War, Congress formed the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, also known as the Joint Committee of 15. Its purpose was this was in December 1865. Its purpose was to address the terms under which the former Confederate states would be readmitted to the Union and to protect the rights of freed slaves. This committee, composed of members from both the House and Senate, became the primary body responsible for drafting what would become the 14th Amendment. So drafting of the amendment took place between December 1865 and April 1866. The Joint Committee, again, like any other committee would do, gathered testimony from people, conducted their own investigations, and held debates over the conditions in the southern states and the rights of the former slaves. By 1866, the committee had drafted the amendment's core provisions addressing citizenship, due process, and equal protection, as well as provisions regarding congressional representation and the former Confederates' eligibility for office. So this is the drafting part of the amendment. Then it has to pass through a vote. So the amendment was introduced in the House on May 10th, 1866. After debates and proposed modifications, the House voted to approve it on May 10th, 1866, but further discussions led to additional changes. So it basically passed through in one day. First vote in the Senate didn't happen until June 8th, however. The amendment was then considered in the Senate after more debates, during which some modifications were made to the House version. The Senate voted in favor June 8th, 1866. So because the Senate had made some changes to it, basically those changes, once again, had to be sort of ironed out. So since the Senate had made changes to the House version, a reconciliation process followed to finalize the wording. Both chambers needed to approve the same version. The reconciled amendment was voted on again in the House on June 13th, 1866, and passed with a required 2/3 majority of both the House and Senate. Now, because this is a constitutional amendment, it requires a 2/3 majority, of course. A regular law would not. Then, also, since it's a constitutional amendment, it had to be approved by the states as well. Once approved by the Congress, the amendment was sent to the states for ratification on June 16th, 1866. Ratification required the approval of 3/4 of the states than 28 of the 37 states. The amendment faced obviously strong opposition, particularly in the southern states. But in this instance, Congress had leverage over the southern states, and that in order to be readmitted to the union, they basically had to pass the amendment. So that's what basically forced them to pass the amendment. Otherwise, it would not have passed. The 14th Amendment was finally ratified on July 9th, 1868. So almost 3 years after it was first introduced, right, in the end of 1865. When Louisiana and South Carolina agreed to ratify it, thus meeting the 3/4 requirement, it was then formally adopted into the Constitution on July 28th, 1868. So quite a long period of time, right, to get this amendment fully ratified. All right, so that more or less covers a general sort of overview on how the legislative process works. Again, it's incredibly complicated. Even the I noticed on the graph about the federal budget deficit. There are different sources. I just want to go back to that for a second. This one says, I read somewhere else that the federal budget was about 6.1 trillion, and the tax revenue is about 4.4 trillion, leading to a deficit of 1.77 trillion. I'm reading here on this graph I took that in 2022, the federal budget is about, let me make this smaller again so you can see it. But the federal spending is about 6 trillion, and the tax revenue is about 5 trillion. So that would lead to a deficit of about 1 trillion. I've read different reports that quoted different things, but I just wanted to make that clear, just in case there's some contradiction with that. You can see that in different years in recent years the federal spending was much higher, so federal spending has come down. It's also come up a lot since about 2019, as you can see here. But basically, the idea of the government running continuous deficits has been going on for a very long time now, as you can see, and as you can see, these deficits are growing larger and larger. One of the reasons, of course, that the federal debt overall is so high. The deficit is basically the gap between taxing and spending every year. The debt then refers to the overall debt, which gets larger and larger, obviously, as every year goes on. And paying interest on that debt is increasingly getting higher as well. I believe now the total interest that the federal government will pay off over the course of a year is about $1 trillion. So $1 trillion of taxpayer money basically just goes to paying off the government debt. Now, where's that government debt go to? Basically, people that lend the government money, usually through buying treasury bonds and things like that. Anyway, so let's turn to this idea of gerrymandering now. So this is an important issue that you see in the House. Now, the reason why it's an issue in the House is because, again, with the Senate, you have two members of two senators are selected from every state, so it's even in that regard. The House is divided up into different, and the two senators basically represent the state as a whole. The House is divided up into various different congressional districts. And then you have this issue then of what determines the boundaries of the different congressional districts that you see in the House. So the term gerrymandering is somewhat of a, convoluted, confusing term. If you just said it would sound like a nonsensical term. Some people refer to it as, partisan bias. For example, in the extreme maps report, which is part of the reading for this class. I also included the speech by Malcolm X, The Ballad or the Bullet, which I'll say now, I'm not going to really cover too much in class. I just want to introduce another reading that was, somewhat easier for people to read, and to choose a quote from. I know that the extreme maps report is very technical and convoluted. So if you don't want to write about something like that, at least you had another option to do that. Now, as it relates to this, I mean, Malcolm X, he does reference gerrymandering. He does reference the filibuster in his speech, although, of course, that is not the most important aspects of that speech. It is a very important speech, though. It's generally considered to be Malcolm X's most important speech, and certainly worth reading. I read several people's papers on it already, and I can see the people seem to uh, enjoy it as well, or at least understand the significance of it. But anyway, so this idea of gerrymandering introduces the idea that you can try to manipulate the boundaries, the district boundaries of each state, in a way to basically help your party win, to give a sort of artificial advantage to a particular political party. And there are various ways in which you can do that. The terminology used here is usually what they call cracking and packing. So basically, you essentially either break up supporters of one party into different districts so that they form a majority in each. So let's say, for example, you are, a Republican state legislature, and you want to redraw the district um, boundaries in a way that's going to benefit your party. So what you do is you basically find out where all the Democratic voters live, which isn't so hard to do. We've already, discussed this to some extent. There's sort of urban rural uh, divide that there is here in this country. Um, but you basically find out where all the Democratic voters live, and you kind of break them up into um, into different congressional districts, so that they basically form a minority in each of the congressional districts, or at least to as much as you possibly can. Another tactic would be that you would then take a bunch of Democratic voters that maybe live over an expanded area, cram them all into one district. So you lose that one district, but then you basically gain, let's say, like three others, because you take all the Democratic voters out of these three other districts, and you sort of cram them all into one. How this is actually done, of course, is very technical and complicated, but the consequences of it are quite significant. And again, as the report shows, basically it leads to kind of an artificial majority for the Republican Party in many different House elections. Maybe not in every one, but in several important recent elections. So here are some examples of various different kinds of so-called gerrymandered districts. North Carolina's 12th, which at one point was considered to be the most gerrymandered district. You can see here by kind of the odd shape of the district here, this weird sort of snaking shape of it. That usually, in many ways, can be kind of a giveaway to it. You can see it's been sort of reformed since then, um, taking on this more kind of blob-like shape, I guess you could say. Here's the Illinois 4th district, also known as the earmuff district. This is actually a Democratic district. So let me switch over now to the extreme maps report. I've summarized some of it here, but I think it'd be interesting to take a little bit of a closer look at this. So this is from the Brennan Center for Justice, which is part of the NYU School of Law. There is a somewhat of more updated report, which I'll also turn to in a moment, but what I did not include as part of the reading. So for those of you who read this, I'm sure probably found it to be somewhat complicated to read. Basically, what we're interested in are the results. So what they do basically is they apply a series of different tests to different congressional districts in the country, and they basically find that the Republican Party has basically an advantage. Now we're going to assume here. Now the tests themselves are fairly technical and complicated. We're not going to pay too much attention, quite frankly, to their methodology. We're really more or less interested in the results of the test. But here's basically more or less their summary, which I suppose is important to know if you don't already know this. So essentially, the process of drawing these congressional maps happens about every 10 years or so, right? Every 10 years, they do a census, and basically the districts are sort of redrawn to reflect changes in the census. As it says here, redistricting allows districts to be rebalanced, ensuring, in theory, that all districts are both equally populated and representative. But this also provides an enormous opportunity for politicians. The chance to redraw a district map means the opportunity to gerrymander and to manipulate a map to create a more favorable set of, of districts for themselves and for their party. Now, this report was done in 2018, so it takes place before the 2020 census. So they reference the 2010 census. They then look at a few House elections in 2012, 2014, and 2016. So again, our key findings include this decade's congressional maps are consistently biased in favor of the Republican Party. The 26 states that account for 85% of congressional districts, Republicans derive a net benefit of at least 16 to 17 congressional seats in the current Congress from partisan bias. Now, there's a more updated report, which still basically holds the same. That they still basically conclude that there's about 16 or so extra seats for the Republican Party from this partisan bias as they call it here. So that means that basically the districts are biased in a way to benefit the Republican Party, which means that in every single House election, the Republican Party has basically an artificial advantage or sort of an unfair advantage, basically, that gives them 16 extra seats than they would ordinarily have. Now, that is very significant because in more than one instance, that would actually change the composition of the majority in the House, including in the current House. So whereas the Republican Party would have a majority in the House, the Democratic Party would have a majority in the House. I mean, that is crucial. I mean, think how important that is for the operations of the federal government. If you have a Democratic president but a Republican House, then forget it. The president can't get anything done. As I've already talked about, you need both houses of the Congress. If even one of them goes to the opposite side, then forget it. You really can't get anything passed. On the other hand, if you have a Republican president, as we're about to have, then having a Republican House makes it that's one less obstacle in the way for the Republican president to do what they want to do. So if you still had a Democratic House, then that would mean it would be that much harder for the Republican president to get done what they want to do. So it's crucially important. I can't state enough how important it is that this partisan bias basically creates a majority for the Republican Party. And I'm saying this, of course, as a hopefully at this point, establish myself pretty clearly as a critic of the Democratic Party. I'm not saying this as a partisan for the Democratic Party. I've spoken many times in this class. I think the Democratic Party is a conservative party. I think by the the definition of what a conservative is, somebody that basically wants to keep the status quo more or less the same. The Democratic Party is a conservative party. The Republican Party is maybe more accurately termed than a reactionary party. A reactionary is basically someone who wants to go back to a previous status quo. So I would say that the Republican Party represents a reactionary political party. The Democratic Party is a conservative political party. This then, I think, allows you to be critical still of both political parties while not falling into that trap of saying, well, they're both exactly the same. Which is, some people get angry when you say things like that. Well, they're not exactly the same, but the differences between the two are fairly minimal. I mean, it's about as minimal as the difference between a conservative and a reactionary. Basically, somebody who wants to keep things the way they are and somebody who wants to go back to the way things were. In either case, what of course is lacking is a true progressive and democratic alternative to either political party. I'm just saying this to sort of preface what I'm about to say here is that I'm extremely critical of the Democratic Party. However, it's quite clear just from a sort of more objective analysis that clearly the current system basically favors the Republican Party in a very unfair way. So they mentioned several of the states that have the most consistent or consistently high levels of partisan bias. I'm not going to go through all of this. But you can see here the states that they consider to be the most biased, basically. So, okay, they refer to the term gerrymandering, which I probably didn't mention, but I did include it on the PowerPoint. You know, it's named after this guy Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts, who was accused very early on in the early 1800s, basically, of trying to do something like this. And the shape of the district was people thought looked like a salamander, which there's an illustration of it also again in the PowerPoint. It doesn't look like a salamander I've ever seen, but anyway, that's where the term gerrymandering comes from. So this is where they basically lay out the different tests that they're going to use: the efficiency gap, the seats to vote curve, the mean median district vote share difference. Again, if this was confusing to people, this is certainly more the science aspect of political science, as I often like to say. This is much less now in theory, much more in the sort of quantitative methods part. So you don't have to concern yourself too much with that. Again though, we're sort of more or less interested in the results, and here are basically the results. So they find applying this test, and this is just the first of three tests. I mean, like, really the only one I'm gonna cover because the other two basically more or less confirm their results also. But basically, they find that again in each of the three elections that they look at, that the Republican Party gains extra seats, and those extra seats themselves kind of vary as you can see here. So they categorize the different states that are controlled by the Republican Party, states that are controlled by the Democratic Party, states where there is a split. One party controls one house of the state legislature, the other party controls the other. States where a political commission or another type of uh, commission besides the states have drawn the congressional district boundaries. If I haven't already mentioned that, I mean that's of course where this problem comes from, is that the state legislature of each state basically votes on where the district boundaries are going to be. So obviously that's a system rife with corruption, or it's very easy for states to sort of tilt things to favor one party over the other. So whatever party has a majority in the state legislature, obviously they're going to be incentivized to try to set up the district boundaries in a way that benefits their state. But in some cases, that power is because it is kind of a shitty system, that power has basically been taken away from the states as well. And you can see where it has been done so. There tends to be much less bias. In some cases, courts have got involved in it as well. I'm not too concerned with those categorizations ever. I really just kind of want to focus on the results here. So you can see in 2012, they estimated between 26 to 37 extra Republican seats. In 2014, 4 to 19. And then in 2016, 17 to 29 extra seats. So let me turn over here to the results of several House elections. As you can see here, this is the more recent report, which again basically says yes, net 16 fewer Biden districts than non-gerrymandered maps. So basically what they're saying is that even now, this report is again from 2024. You can see one of the authors from the earlier report, Michael Lee, is here. So basically, yes, even in the current Congress and under the current census, there's still a bias that basically favors the Republican Party. So what they're saying is that in 2012, they say about 26 to 37 extra Republican seats. Well, if you look at the majority here in 2012, that definitely falls within that range. And here's another thing that stands out. In 2012, Democrats won a majority of votes, but did not gain control of the House. They picked up some seats, but in theory, if the districts were all sort of fairly drawn, obviously the party that got more votes overall. What they're doing, of course, is aggregating all the votes that were cast nationwide, as you can see here. But obviously, how can it lead to a result where, one party gets more votes overall, but still does not have control of the House? By all rights, the Democratic Party should have had control of the House. Let's go back to 2010. Now, of course, anything on Wikipedia, you should obviously check the citations. Of course, you should always check the citations anyway. This is coming from the Office of the Clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives, so I'm assuming this is fairly reputable source. Let's go back a little bit, in fact, to 2010. You can see that the Democrats were slaughtered in that election, lost 63 seats, one of the worst defeats for any party in history. As it says here, the worst defeat in a House midterm election since 1938, as well as the largest House swing since 1948. So one of the worst ever. However, and of course, if you go back to the timing of who was president then, this is Obama, about after his first year in office. Now you go up to, or almost at the end of his second year in office, in fact. Now you go to 2012, which was also a re-election year, an election year, I mean. Obama basically lost the House after 2010 and never regained it back. So essentially, that essentially killed the Obama administration, right? They were basically not able to get anything done. Again, I'm a critic of the Obama administration. So even in the first 2 years, I don't think they really accomplished all that much anyway. Not that it was going to, be beneficial to people in the country at least. But again, it's quite clear that after 2010, the Obama administration was essentially kind of a lame duck presidency. They could not get anything done. However, what they're showing here is that basically the Obama administration could have regained the House, or the Democratic Party rather could have regained the House in 2012. I think that would have been fairly significant, maybe. Certainly, if you're a fan of the Obama administration or a fan of the Democratic Party, you would at least want your party to win. The Democrats still had control of the Senate and would continue to have control in 2014. So if they regained control of the House in 2012, you would have had a Democratic president with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. Things conceivably could have been much different than what they actually were. So again, the highest importance should be attached to this, when we understand that not only does the Republican Party rather gain an artificial advantage, but basically in many instances it would have basically changed who actually had control of the House of Representatives, which I think is quite significant. In 2014, it wouldn't have been as significant. I mean, but this is now building on the result of 2012. So who knows what would have happened if the Democrats had regained control of the House in 2012. If you look at their report, the extra seats won by the Republican Party, was not as significant in 2014, but was in 2016. So let me go back to that again. 17 to 29 extra seats in 2016. So yeah, I mean, it would have been, they would have had to be at the higher end of that range. And again, this is, proceeding along the way things actually were, right? If we go back to 2012 and say that, well, the Democrats win back the House in 2012, I mean, who knows what would have happened after that? But basically, again, the idea here is that in at least two recent House elections, the Republican Party probably would not have had a majority in the House if not for the effects of this partisan bias or gerrymandering, as it's called. Now, the Democrats did, of course, win back control of the House in 2018 and continued on in 2020, but they lost it again in 2022. So in 2022 and 2024 also here, but look at the a very slim majority for the Republican Party. Now, again, according to the more recent report, the Republican Party still has an advantage of basically 16 extra seats. So just do the simple math right here. If not for partisan bias, the Republican Party probably would not have won control of the House in 2022 and would not have it now, an even slimmer majority now. So that's significant. So you can add to that, besides 2012 and 2016, you could also add basically the 2022 House and the incoming 2024 House, or the House that was elected in 2024, would also not have a Republican majority if not for this effect of partisan bias. So I think that's a very significant thing. And of course, what this does is that, going back to sort of, the key themes of this class, is that it takes an already undemocratic system of government and it makes it even more so, right? It makes it even less uh, democratic because the House is supposed to be the most democratic branch of government. I mean, the founders were quite explicit in their intent behind creating the Senate and the Electoral College and the Supreme Court, the three institutions that I kind of single out or focus on as being the most undemocratic branches of government. The House is supposed to be a democratic branch of government, but it's even made even less democratic because of that. So I hope that's clear. All right, so yeah, and this more or less summarizes that. Now let's move on to the filibuster and talk about the Senate a little bit. So the Senate is a little bit different. Now, again, the Senate is already basically, constructed to be an undemocratic branch of government from the very get-go. But even that is made even less so, made even less democratic because of this filibuster tactic here. So what the filibuster is basically is a tactic to delay or prevent a legislative proposal from being passed. Basically what it does is because of what some people would consider to be a loophole in the rules of the Senate, a senator can, if they are at the podium, can speak for an unlimited period of time. There's no limit to how long they can speak for the most part, for certain things. In the House, you do not really have this issue. Again, the amount of time that people can speak on the House floor is very much regulated by, the Speaker of the House and by the Rules Committee. So that, that issue does not become an issue there. But a senator can speak for as long as they want. And basically, as long as they are talking, the Senate cannot really do anything else. But there are rules to that as well. They must stay at the podium and cannot stop talking. You cannot take a bathroom break. There's nothing that you can do. The longest recorded is Strom Thurmond, the infamous segregationist senator who spoke for 24 hours, 18 minutes in 1957, nonstop. Supposedly he was just reading out of a phone book at certain points, just reading the alphabetical list of names in a phone book, just trying to kill time. Now, why would people do something like this? They are trying to prevent a bill from getting passed. In this case, it was the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Now, originally, the Senate could just end debate, could basically just tell somebody to sit down and shut up, essentially, by a simple majority of votes. But that rule was changed. And basically, what it required at first was a 2/3 majority. Now changed basically to 3/5, basically 60 votes. So the only way you can end a filibuster is by having 60 votes. If you have 60 senators say, sit down and shut up, basically, then you can, basically end a filibuster that way. Otherwise, if you do not have 60 votes, then there's nothing to prevent a senator from speaking as long as they want to, and in some cases going to very extreme lengths to filibuster the passage of certain laws. The first filibuster was in 1837. It became more common after the Civil War and became common again during the Civil Rights era. So much so that by the 1970s, essentially the rules of the Senate have changed that almost all legislation now requires 60 votes. Again, there are exceptions to that, but most important legislation now requires 60 votes. So what that does, of course, is that it makes it even harder for votes to get passed. Now it's not just good enough to have 51 votes. So if you are, the Democratic Party and you have 50 votes or 51 votes, say you have 50 votes and then you have the tie-breaking vote cast by the vice president, which of course you did actually have that. in the recent Senate. That's not good enough. Now you need to have not just 51 votes, but you need basically 60 votes. So it makes it even harder to get things passed through the Senate as well. In 2013, Democratic leader Harry Reid, citing what he considered to be unbelievable, unprecedented opposition from the Republican Party, voted for what was called the nuclear option, or overriding a standing rule of the Senate by a 52 to 48 vote. This allowed all executive branch and federal judicial appointments below the level of Supreme Court to be voted in on a simple majority. However, of course, once the Republicans took control of the Senate, or once they had a Republican president in office as well, they basically then expanded this to include Supreme Court nominees. It's worth pointing out that all of Trump's Supreme Court picks were appointed with less than 60 votes, by the way. Trump's tax bill was also passed with less than 60 votes, as have been other instances of tax cuts, like some of the Reagan tax cuts were passed with less than 60 votes as well. But I'll talk about that more when I turn to the presidency, basically next class. So I'm going to pretty much wrap things up here. Sometimes in class, I would play a little, video of Ted Cruz reading out Green Eggs and Ham during a Senate filibuster. I won't do that. Maybe I'll include that as a link though. But okay, so that's it for this. Next class, we will talk about the executive branch. All right, so take care, everyone.